special welcome to Professor Simon Ditchfield as we have this magnificent moment of the Ganss Award presentation. I'm Father Casey Beaumier. I serve as the Hog Vice President for Mission and Ministry here at Boston College, and I was the former director of the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies. So now we have an even more illustrious and gifted director for the Institute, Cristiano Castellini, who will come forward to make the introduction. But I want to thank each of you for being here today. Jesuit Studies is an academic discipline that has developed deep roots here at Boston College, and we're grateful for the university's confidence in being so supportive of Jesuit Studies. So in a short amount of time, we've been able to accomplish an awful lot of good for the global network of the Society of Jesus. And we're delighted that we can offer this recognition to a scholar in the field who has made such great contributions to our institute and to the society and its history. I also want to share with you that the Institute is now part of the Division of Mission and Ministry. So we'll be able to continue to magnify the great efforts of deepening people's appreciation of Jesuit history, spirituality, and pedagogy, especially within the university. So I think this will be a great move for all of our efforts, and tonight we're just delighted to be able to welcome you to one of the signature events of the Institute. So I want to turn it over to the academic director, Cristiano Castellini, who will make our introduction.
So, thank you, Father Lakey, for kicking him out of the event. Thank you, Father. So I'm very honored, and actually, some questions I'm introducing you to for the first time after it's been 14 years I've been here at Boston College, and I've been blessed with being part of this community, which I'm proud of right now. It sounds like home for me. Thank you for making this happen. So, Father Lakey, Father Casey, Provost Quigley, Father Brian Paulson, and family, colleagues, friends, welcome. It's a pleasure to greet you on behalf of the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies. Today we have the great privilege of hosting Professor Simon Ditchfield from the University of York as our guest, our lecturer, our partner in conversation today. Founded 11 years ago, more than 11 years ago actually, here at Boston College, the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies was born from a clear vision that the vitality and future of a Jesuit university as distinguished as Boston College depend, in part, on a deep and deliberate commitment to its Jesuit heritage and identity. Just as the Division of Mission and Ministry was established in the late 90s to recenter the mission at the very heart of the university's educational and research endeavors, what Father Casey often describes as the cultivation of the heart that vivifies the nurturing of the mind. So the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies was founded to promote a deeper understanding of Jesuit history, spirituality, and pedagogy. What does it mean to be a Jesuit educational institution? Sources and the historiographical endeavor provide for the depth that is necessary if we want to promote an understanding of the tradition that scratches the surface of a maze of key expressions and even commonplaces that often populate the imaginary of Jesuit institutions. Under Father Casey's leadership, the Institute has flourished. Over the past decades, we have grown in numbers, projects, and impact. We managed on behalf of the conference, the Jesuit Conference of Canada in the United States, the Institute of Jesuit Sources, a publishing house that produces both scholarly and accessible works. We offer a graduate level certificate in Jesuit Studies pursued by educators and leaders across Jesuit institutions in the United States, Canada, Ireland, and beyond, including Jesuit information. We stand at the forefront of digital humanities in Jesuit Studies, developing and curating resources accessible through the portal to Jesuit Studies that Alessandro Corsi here, our colleague, works on. And we conduct research and convene academic gatherings, international symposia on Jesuit studies, workshops, Jesuit Studies cafes, and both online and in-person conferences, often in collaboration with departments on campus and universities around the world. Through the Institute, 3 open access journals are now available online and on paper. The Jesuit Educational Quarterly, Studies in the Spirituality of Jesuits, and the International Symposia on Jesuit Studies. Together, we think they advance the scholarly understanding of the Jesuit tradition in its many dimensions. We also accompany this intellectual mission with robust programs on faith formation, such as Ever to Excel and the AMDG program, which invite participants to integrate heart and mind in the Ignatian spirit. These connections between faith and intellect, mission and scholarship, have led to the Institute's integration into the Division of Mission and Ministry at Boston College. In this new chapter, we hope to continue contributing in the same spirit that has guided us so far, through academic work, academic partnership, and academic dialogue, deepening our understanding of what makes a Jesuit institution a truly Jesuit one. Rediscovering and recovering Jesuit sources is indeed essential if we are to provide roots, solid roots for the future. Today, we are honored to present the Ganss Award to a scholar whose contribution to the field of Jesuit history are universally recognized, Professor Simon Ditchfield. His work has illuminated the study of Jesuit history within the broader context of early modern Catholicism, with particular insight and rigor. Professor Ditchfield is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a member of the Accademia Ambrosiana in Milan, and a honorary member of the Italian Hagiography Society. After earning his BA in history from the University of York, he spent several years teaching in Italy before pursuing graduate studies at the Warburg Institute, University of London, where he completed his PhD in combined historical studies. His distinguished career includes fellowship from the British Academy and the Lever Pullman's Trust, and co-leadership of the interdisciplinary project Conversion Narratives in Early Modern Europe. His research has profoundly shaped our understanding of early modern Catholicism, especially hagiography, history writing, and the Society of Jesus. He is currently completing a major work, Papacy and Peoples in the Making of Roman Catholicism as a World Religion, 1500 to 1700. Professor Ditchfield has also been a dear friend to our institute, having delivered a keynote lecture in this very room during one of our symposia in Jesuit Studies. It is therefore a great joy to recognize him today as the recipient of the Ganss Award, which honors significantly scholarly contribution to the field of Jesuit Studies. Past recipients of the award include Father John Padler, John O'Malley, Paul Brandon, Father Festo Nkenda, and Professor Stefania Tutino from last year. Professor Ditchfield now joins their distinguished company. At this time, I invite Father Casey and Professor Ditchfield to come forward for the presentation of this award. Thank you all. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the Feore Family Lecture, a series that brings to Boston College the world's leading scholars in Jesuit studies for dialogue with the university and the public. The title of today's lecture is When the Saints Go Marching In, Jesuit Hagiography in Counter-Reformation Context. Professor Ditchfield will offer an introductory talk, followed by a conversation led by Professor Emanuele Colombo here, a research scholar at the Institute and faculty member at the Lynch School of Education and Human Development. Please join me in welcoming Professor Simon Ditchfield.
First of all, I'm deeply honoured to receive the George E. Ganss Award. As a young scholar and teacher, I benefited enormously from Father Ganss's wonderful Paulist Press edition of the Spiritual Exercises and Selected Writings. In addition, I would like to thank Boston College, in particular Father Casey Beaumier, Cristiano Casalini, and Emanuele Colombo, and for their invitation, and to Anushka Lisette Gras for making all the practical arrangements. But finally, I would like to pay tribute to the memory of a very special person who did so much to open Jesuit studies to the world, the late John O'Malley. John was such an encouraging friend and supporter to me for over 15 years. In view of his unique mix of personal goodness and persuasive eloquence, which cast a spell on all those who met him, I think that the Roman rhetorician Quintilian's description of the good orator, well versed in speech, is a good one, in eloquence, an apt one. By way of an autobiographical aside, I found a quotation from his presidential address, which I put up there, which was then published in the Catholic Historical Review, where I read it while preparing for my thesis defense. I found it very liberating, as it freed me to think of early modern Roman Catholicism at work in the wider world. But before I get underway with my task today, I also want to pay further tribute to our hosts this afternoon, Boston College, for having also generously hosted in 1997 and 2002 two big international conferences which resulted in the major essay collections on the slide before you. Taken together, these volumes, published in 1999 and 2006, to both of which Father O'Malley contributed his inimitable editorial skills, played a fundamental part in launching a new phase in Jesuit studies, in which all scholars, from within and in particular without the society, were welcome to contribute, and from which we are still benefiting. Turning now to my talk, this image before you has become very much an icon of triumphant Catholicism, with the crossing of St. Peter's there in the centre, decked out for the simultaneous canonization not only of the Jesuit saints Loyola and Xavier, top right, but also with those of St. Isidore the Farmer, top left, Teresa of Avila, bottom left, and finally Filippo Neri, bottom right. All of these figures have in turn been surrounded by scenes of events from their respective lives and miracles attributed to them, each of which has been carefully identified in Latin inscriptions. These were likely based closely upon official accounts generated from their canonization trials, notably the reports sent to the highest court of the Roman Curia, the auditors of the Rota, which would have been in turn derived directly from canonization trial testimony. As such, this is a truly Counter-Reformation vision of the picturing of sainthood, frozen in time and space, an iconic symbol of top-down, centralized control. So, it is perhaps surprising to discover that the ceremony in the form it actually took was accidental, or at least last minute. For the canonization not only of Teresa and Filippo, but also of Ignatius and Francis Xavier, had in actual fact been piggybacked onto the long-planned canonization of the comparatively obscure Spanish peasant Isidore, who died in the 12th century and whose chief claim to fame at the time was that he was patron saint of the capital of the first empire on which the sun never set, Madrid, and therefore merited the generous financial support of the Spanish king. This was reflected in the fact that the decorations of the wooden theatre you see in the centre, the crossing of St. Peter's, was given over exclusively to depiction of the deeds of Isidore, and that of the 4 other candidates for sainthood are only represented in banners hanging from the dome of St. Peter's. However, as some of you might already be thinking, the 2 Jesuits have been dead for over half a century in 1622. What took so long? Why the wait? particularly when taking into consideration the speed with which candidates are not infrequently canonized today. For example, St. Carlo Acutis, shown here in a photo taken by me just a few weeks ago in a parish church on the Maltese island of Gozo, who died of cancer at the age of just 15 in 2006, and was the first saint to be canonized by Pope Leo on September the 7th this year. In other words, less than 20 years after Carlo's death. So in my own research, I found myself trying to answer why candidates took so long to be canonized, or indeed account for why they failed to be canonized at all. In other words, unlike a rather famous article by Peter Burke, I became more interested in how not to be a Counter-Reformation saint. Indeed, I soon discovered that those founders of religious orders with a saintly reputation who had recently died, who were referred to at the time as the modern blesseds, i beati moderni, were perceived by Rome as something of a problem, as the papacy was seeking to exert stronger regulatory control not only over the cult of saints. In the case of Ignatius Loyola, this reluctance to canonize extended even to the order he had founded. The first edition of Pedro de Rivadeneira's Life of Ignatius, published in 1572, in just 500 copies and circulated almost exclusively inside the society, pointedly excluded accounts of miraculous activity achieved at Loyola's intercession, in vitam or post-mortem. In this text, according to Rivadeneira, the real miracle of Ignatius was the society itself. It was several decades later, based on Rivadeneira's shorter account given in a collected volume of saints' lives he wrote, the Flos Sanctorum of 1601, that we find 6 chapters dedicated to his miracles. But it was only 8 years previous that a decision had been taken by the extraordinary General Congregation of the Society of 1593-94 to seek the canonization of Loyola and Ziegler. A decision that was quite possibly linked to the attempt by the Superior General Claudio Acquaviva, who had previously been opposed to the idea of promoting Ignatius' cult, because he wanted at the time to unify the two then warring factions of the Spanish and the Italian Jesuits behind the twin banners of strong internal governance, represented by Loyola, and private external mission, represented by Xavier. My personal research journey, however, began in the North Italian town of Piacenza, some 60 miles to the southeast of Milan, situated at the crossing of the River Po. On the left is a photo of perhaps its most famous monument, the medieval town hall, widely and proudly referred to as Il Gotico, owing to its architectural style. And this is where I spent 2 years immediately after my first degree in history, teaching English as a foreign language, and to which I returned when looking for both my MPhil and my PhD dissertation topics after I returned to academia. The image on the right is the title page in the first volume of the Ecclesiastical History of the town, which was published in 1644 by an otherwise obscure canon of the cathedral, Pier Maria Campi, to which I dedicated my doctorate. In the course of my research, I discovered that Campi's prodigious historical research, which led ultimately to 3 folio volumes and the painstaking transcription of literally hundreds of medieval documents and inscriptions, had been prompted by the request from the Bishop of Piacenza for new hagiographical readings to include in the offices of local saints, which were all collected together as an appendix to the recently revised Roman Breviary. This liturgical book of the Divine Office, containing the psalms, hymns, lessons, hagiographical as well as biblical, and prayers to be recited daily by all priests and related religious, was published in a revised form in the immediate aftermath of the Council of Trent, whose canons and decrees determined the doctrine and worship of the Roman Catholic Church for almost exactly 400 years, down to the Second Vatican Council. Now, not dissimilar to what had happened after Vatican II, when several well-known saints were removed from the calendar owing to the fact that evidence for their historical existence was inadequate. After the Council of Trent, only partly in response to a Protestant polemic, Rome sought to prune the calendar of saints and remove the more outlandish and less credible details preserved in the saints' lessons of those who remained. As a consequence, local scholars, the length and breadth of Roman Catholic Christendom, found themselves digging into archives, poring over documents, and scrutinizing images and inscriptions to demonstrate the antiquity of their local heroes and other manifestations of diocesan devotional distinctiveness. The principal means by which the pruning of the saints' calendar was achieved was by the introduction of standardized, universally valid printed service books, like those before you, beginning with the Revised Roman Breviary on the left of 1568, and then in the right and centre you have the 1586 edition of Roman Martyrology, which was first issued in 1583, but with only historical notes 3 years later. In this way, I discovered that hagiography was a largely unwritten chapter in the history of history writing, and that the so-called history wars between rival confessions, in which the Protestants argued there had been a decline in apostolic purity from at least the 4th century of the Christian era, to which the Catholics responded that the church they represented expressed complete continuity with apostolic times, was arguably dwarfed in scale by the history wars within Roman Catholicism, and more often between rival dioceses and even between rival religious orders than between them and Rome. This drove the argument of my doctorate that turned into my monograph, and furthermore it's been a theme that has informed much of my subsequent historical research and about which the remainder of my talk this afternoon will be concerned. Specifically, I became interested in the mechanisms by which particular local cults secured their place in a church which, post-Reformation, was preoccupied with cutting down the number of saints' cults, as I've said, and with tightening up the procedure of those who were to be added to the pantheon who could receive public devotion. In more abstract terms, I prescribe this as the reconciliation of the particular with the universal, which I discovered when my Piacentine case study was not simply an imposition of the Reformed Roman Rite on local traditions, but rather a negotiated process, refereed by consultants working in the relevant Roman Curial Standing Committee, or Congregation of Rites and Ceremonies, which had been founded in 1588. In addition to such mandated cults, it needs to be remembered that the majority of saints' cults, then and now, were merely permitted, principally by means of the concession which recognised all those candidates who could prove at least 200 years of continuous liturgical observance. This provision was contained in the bull Quod Nobis, which prefaced the Roman Breviary of 1568, with its dramatically slimmed down calendar, as we've seen. But where did a new religious order, such as the Society of Jesus, fit into this dynamic? And this is what I'll be saying for the remainder of my paper. To begin with, the order's very youth meant that it was even more imperative that it communicated a distinctive identity that in turn conferred legitimacy. This explains the distinctiveness of the Society's centralised bureaucratic processes and governance analysed so brilliantly by Marcus Friedrich and mined with such profit by Stefano Coutinho, just to mention the last two awardees. But first of all, the Society had to situate itself within the topography of Rome itself. Those of you in the audience who have ever visited the Roman HQ of the Jesuits in the Via dei Penitenzieri near St. Peter's will be familiar with this image which greets visitors in the lobby. This map of the city identifies all the buildings used by the Society, not only churches but also the Roman College, as well as those specialised particular mission fields, including the Collegio Germanico, preparing missionaries for the German-speaking lands. However, the Society had also to locate itself in relation to its rapidly expanding missions, and here inspired use was made of what was regarded as the oldest Marian icon in Rome, that of Santa Maria Maggiore. This slide here shows San Francisco Borja, the third Superior General of the Society, shown on the left holding an official copy of the so-called Salus Populi Romani icon of the Virgin Child, also known as Madonna of the Snow, a privilege he secured from Pope Pius V. On the right is an early painted copy from the former novitiate of the Society in Sant'Andrea al Quirinale, Rome. By means of engraved prints, Borja and his successors disseminated this image so effectively and extensively that it became arguably as important an identifying logo, if you like, as that of the IHS monogram. This slide here on the left, you've got the original, on the right, the official engraving, and in the centre, the image as reframed by Paul V Borghese in the Borghese Chapel in Santa Maria Maggiore, which was built and made in the first decade of the 17th century. This slide here shows more examples of copies the icon has inspired. Left to right, the so-called the Nagasaki scroll, and then in the middle you've got the Manaha Mughal miniature, and on the right, the famous full-length Chinese version on a silk scroll, now in the Field Museum in Chicago. I must say, actually, this is very misleading, these slides, in the sense that they don't give any idea of the actual size. The thing on the left of the Madonna on the scroll from Japan is the size of my hand. The thing in the middle, the little miniature, the Manahan miniature, is literally about the size of my medal. And only the Field Museum Ming Madonna is almost life-size. So in a sense, you've got here three very different visual languages being used by indigenous artists to copy a Western prototype. But as well as images, the Jesuits made full use of the printed and spoken, recited word. Francisco Benci is an emblematic figure here. Professor of rhetoric in the Roman College, he was author of the 5,600 hexameter poem Quique Martyrs, the Five Martyrs, which was first published in 1591, shown here on the left, whose subject were the five martyrs of Concordia in the region of Salsette, just south of Goa, India. This epic poem sought to do for the recently founded Society of Jesus what Virgil had done for the newly established Roman Principate under Augustus. Though the poem failed to promote the beatification of the five Jesuits in question, which did not come about until 1893, it did succeed in acting as a model for the composition and recitation of hexameter verse in the sublime Virgilian style for generations of students, and was later excerpted in such widely circulated collections of poems used again for teaching as the Parnassus in the middle there, Parnassus Societatis Jesu, 1654. But Benci also edited and polished the prose of editions of the annual letters, shown there on the right, which not only served a propagandistic purpose, boosting the society's reputation over and against its rivals and enemies, but also served to sustain an esprit de corps amongst the Jesuits themselves. Systematized by Loyola's secretary, Juan Alfonso de Polanco, already in 1547, who required local superiors to write Rome at 4 monthly intervals. As Paul Nellis notes, this was a collective enterprise and so contributed to society's collective identity. Over time, the Jesuit mission letter assumed recognizable form, a well-digested survey of mission life with local, social and religious customs and natural phenomena added. Sometimes print and image were combined, as can be seen here in Geronimo Nadal's illustrated gospel, with the alphabetically arranged annotations which enhanced its didactic potential. There were no fewer than 153 engravings commissioned from the same artist who had made the copy of the Madonna of Santa Maria Maggiore. Not only was this work widely circulated beyond Europe, but as you can see here, the Jesuit missionary Giulio Aleni adopted it for a Chinese woodblock edition in 1637. Now, such was Jesuit self-confidence in using print and image to promote their activities, that when it came to marking their first centenary in 1640, it seemed only appropriate for the province with the highest number of Jesuits to do so by commissioning the extraordinary monument to the art of printing and engraving that is the Imago Primi Seculi, which also played with Latin panegyric and the art of the emblem on a heroic scale. There are 952 pages, folio pages, and 127 emblems. And in fact, the most populous province was not, you might think, Rome or Spain, but actually Flanders or Belgium, so covering the southern Netherlands and northeastern France. One of the issues shown here, with the motto, "One world is not enough," which sounds as if it should be a contender for the title of the next film of the James Bond franchise, channels this confident ambition. Amazingly, the Belgian province was also the location for the most ambitious work of saints' lives ever attempted. Founded in Antwerp in 1630, its leading light was Jean Bolle, shown here on the right, who subsequently gave his name to the group of scholars who still exist today as the Bollandists, though they are now based not in Antwerp but in Brussels, and who for the next 300 years worked their way through the calendar year, assembling the most important texts in Latin, translated from Greek when required, for each saint's feast. This work now numbers 67 folio volumes and 60,000 pages, but it remains incomplete, having reached the 10th of November in 1925, though an introduction to December was published in 1940. I once asked Father Robert Goddy, who has been the director of the Bollandists for some time, why they have not got around to finishing the job. I remain not wholly convinced by his reply, delivered with a resigned smile, that the exponential increase in scholarship makes a selection of which text to edit nigh impossible. My own hunch, however, is that as the ultimate monument to polemic power erudition, which I spent my whole academic career arguing was the crucial dynamic behind the revolution in historical scholarship, which the Counter-Reformation, rather than the Renaissance, brought to the peak in the 2 centuries between the close of the Council of Trent and the suppression of the Old Society. There no longer existed the same, or exists even now, the same confessional need or imperative to finish the job. However, the Jesuits did not ignore publications in the vernacular, and in the mid-17th century, the Superior General commissioned one of the Society's star preachers, Daniele Bartoli, to write a geographically global history of the Society of Jesus in Italian, beginning with the life of Ignatius in 1650, shown here in its second edition, with an accompanying illustration which shows the desire to see the founder, saint of the Society, as inspiring missions to the 4 parts of the world, illustrated by personifications who frame the globe. Bartoli reluctantly obeyed the order to continue his history, which he described in terms of a boring chore which nailed him to his desk in Rome, when what he really wanted to do was conduct experiments on acoustics and the properties of ice, as well as write moral essays and flashy sermons. Over the next 15 years, there appeared volumes on Asia, China, Japan, England, and Italy, but the volumes on America and the rest of Europe never got written. As can be seen from the prominence of St. Francis Xavier in the illustration accompanying the edition of the first part of Bartoli's history of missions in Asia, the work, at least for the first half, effectively becomes almost a life of the Basque saints. As the art historian Rachel Miller has argued, from being considered initially as simply apostle to the Indies, in time, Xavier becomes represented visually as the apostle to all the Christian world. On the left, you have Francesco Curadis, St. Francis Xavier preaching to representatives of the 4 continents. And you can see it includes a group of 4 figures on the right side of the canvas who coherently represent the 4 continents. There's the young European man wearing red hose, an embroidered doublet, a cape, and hat adorned with an ostrich feather. Next to him is a young African man, identifiable by his skin colour, and he speaks to an American figure with a bare chest, feather skirt, and feather headdress. And the final figure in the grouping wears an Ottoman costume with a tulip pattern, complete with turban. All of this when we know that Xavier only ever knew Europe and Asia, and never been to Africa or America. On the right, however, we have an illustration from the most comprehensive and richly illustrated martyrology the Society ever conceived, which was compiled by the Bohemian Jesuit Matthias Tanner, and published in Prague in 1675. A copy of the work up there in front. And it shows here the Jesuit missionary Marcello Mastrilli, who insisted on entering Japan in the 1630s, by which time it was effectively a suicide mission. And there you can see him about to be dispatched, and he's appealing to the example of Francis Xavier floating down from the right. Here are the engravings depicting the allegories of Jesuit suffering from the four parts of the world, from left to right: Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. And these are taken from Tanner's Martyrology, whose full name tells you, full title rather, tells you exactly what it's about. Quote, "The Society of Jesus, militant for the defence of God, faith, church, and piety, prepared to lose their lives and shed their own blood in Europe, Africa, Asia, and America against Gentiles, Mohammedans, Jews, heretics, and the empires. Asia occupies just under half the coverage, with 122 martyrs, including 51 Japanese, Africa 67, Europe 68, and America just 51. So I close, however, with what is perhaps most immediately recognisable of all my slides, Andrea Pozzo's St. Ignatius in Glory, 1691-94, which spans the name of the Church of St. Ignazio in Rome. It is an image that is invariably used to illustrate the global reach of the Jesuit missions. However, reach is not the same as grasp. If the best part of 2 decades I spent researching and writing a book on the making of Roman Catholicism as a world religion have taught me anything, it is that while the reality has had to wait the conversion of sub-Saharan Africa in the post-colonial period, the idea of Roman Catholicism as a world religion have been successfully sown, or perhaps I should say sold, by the persuasive propagandists working, as we've seen, in multiple media, and inspired by the fact that their founders' eyes, in the words of John O'Malley, were not on Wittenberg, but on Jerusalem. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I'm Feore Family, another Italian, as you can hear, working and studying and researching at the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies. And we will have a couple of questions for you, and then maybe also from the audience. The first thing I see is a large group of undergraduates here, and I want to ask you, so you as an undergraduate in the 70s in York, UK, how did you get interested in the Catholic Church and Catholic saints? How did it happen? What was your journey?
Well,
Gradually.
Is this going to work if I hold it like this? Or do I just have to hold it quick? Okay. I came to Jesuit roughly later, really, but I suppose when I was at university in the late 70s, the sort of echoes of Marxism were still going, and I used to get really cross with economic determinists, not least of which, but I hate maths and don't understand economics. But I did also think that there's more to motivation than materiality, and in fact, people are often motivated by cultural and spiritual reasons. And I suppose my light bulb moment in that respect came from actually before I came to university. An aspiring high school teacher who sent me to read an article by a guy who became later my mentor, a guy called John Bossy, who wrote a book called, an article in the early 60s on the nature of Elizabethan Catholicism. And his insight about this was saying, well, actually, the people we should be looking at are not the Jesuit martyrs and like Henry Campion, but actually the sort of, what he called seigneurial Catholics, the sort of quiet Catholics from the countryside who are trying to keep their head down and keep their faith. And I found from that it had resonated with me because actually, ever since my own work, I've been interested in how tradition works and how tradition sustains itself. And so I suppose really that was when the seeds happened, really were planted, but it was very much, as I've tried to explain, of accidental. I sort of thought I was writing about history writing in Italy and then discovered that people were writing history because they wanted to justify their saints, and their local saints. Does that help to explain?
Absolutely. It's great also to see that teachers and professors can have an impact on
Oh, certainly.
I was fascinated by your representation of Rome, and especially Ignatian Rome. I've been bringing American college students to Rome for about 14 years, and there is something magic, there is something fascinating happening there when you walk around the cities of Rome. I want to ask you, what was your impact with Rome, and especially the Ignatian Rome? The churches, the Jesuits and the Ignatius, and then the archive of the Society of Jesus, which is a place where you enter and you can see documents from all over the world. And you also edited a great book, a companion to early modern Rome, together with Pamela Jones, who are here with us. And so I want to ask you, what was and what is your impact with the Ignatian Rome?
Well, let's start at the end really and say that working with Pam and Barbara Rich, our other editors, it was a sheer pleasure. I'm so pleased that in the end, finally, I felt that it was a debt I owed to Rome. So it was great to have two such fantastic colleagues to work with. We did the volume. It was a real tribute. But again, when I had my first time spent in Rome, more than just a week or so, I spent the whole time avoiding the rock Rome. I remember carrying around Richard Krautheim's Rome Profile of the City, and I allowed myself to go up to the Jubilee of 1300, and I refused to look at anything else, including to people. And then gradually, I sort of opened my eyes to people like Bernini and Borromini, but it was very much later, particularly when I spent a year at the British School of Rome, on my postgraduate research, that the riches of realizing that all archival roads lead to Rome. And I always remember when I was looking at my Mac Capri and going up to a librarian in the Vatican library and saying, now I've got this problem here. My person refers to this manuscript with this number. How am I going to be able to trace that? He looked at me and said, well, it's the same number. That's 40 years later. So you're actually seeing, and the other thing is of course, RC, and when I was working, particularly when I was working with my saints cults, the congregation, the archival congregation of the Cause of Saints, they're still making saints. They're working archives. Although RC is looking at the Jesuit the archive of the Roman province, the Jesuit Central Archive is an historical archive. Still, certain things there relevant to practice. So they're not just dead places. They have echoes. What I loved actually was this sort of present past business, if you like, heritage. It's live, and so it wasn't just something dusty. And it was a realization, I suppose, that all these amazing buildings that we've seen on documentaries, whatever, actually were containers for dynamic institutions that had weathered the storm. In the case of the Jesuits, a storm that actually temporarily abolished them, and then they restored themselves. So I suppose it's again coming back to the idea of the resilience of tradition.
Yeah, I want to continue on this line. You showed a picture of Carlo Acutis. So the last two saints made by Pope Leo, Carlo Acutis and Giorgio Frassati, are both saints who studied with the Jesuits in high school. And because of that, they were also in the network of the Society of Jesus, and from local saints rooted in their cities, Milan and Turin. Now they are global saints. So the global aspect in your presentation was crucial. So first of all, I will invite everyone at the end of this conversation, at the end of the evening, to take a look at the book we have there. The engravings from the 17th century are there in a real copy. We have been able to make it out from our library Institute.
The trigger warnings have been nasty pictures.
And you can see these images of global saints. But the Society of Jesus, and here I have a question also for your current project about the history of global Catholicism. The Society of Jesus, the early Jesuits, were very important, big players in making Catholicism global. Tell us something about that. What fascinated you and what are you discovering in your current
Well, I
research?
suppose really what I'm trying to put across is the fact that it's about the idea. Like I remember being, about 5-6 years into the project and realised actually that Roman Catholicism was not a world religion by the end of the period. Because we have to wait until sub-Saharan Africa gets Catholicism, which actually happens after the end of empire, after 1960. But really, the idea was, because the Jesuits had more than any other order, not exclusively, because there are lots of orders, as I'm always reminded by an Irish friend of mine, there are more Franciscans. And I said, well, that does tell you something, but not necessarily something you might want me to say. But the thing is, the Jesuits were the ones who had planted themselves because they were more effective in persuading people, more effective in, if you like to say, their image. And what they did is by recounting these valiant deeds of daring do in the New World, attempting to convert, which quite often ended in disaster, they managed to sort of create a kind of, how can I say, really, a realm of possibility and perhaps a sort of a vision of what it's like to be, what does it mean to be a Christian and to be a Roman Catholic Christian. And in a sense, what these saints' lives and descriptions of the New World and Asia and what have you, like Bartley, what they do is they introduce a whole new imaginary universe, but they also get people to reflect ultimately on what it is to be a Christian and a Catholic Christian. So in a sense, the very failure or the shortcoming that you see in some failed, for example, what martyrdom usually means that the mission has failed. But it also made people think, well, actually, what is it really to be a Roman Catholic in the old world? And in an article I wrote a while back, I actually argued and said, well, rather than looking at sort of what the old world converts to the new, what it is, the attempt to convert the new world actually ended up converting or reconverting the old, but it's actually sort of getting people to think about what it means to be, really raise the temperature of what it means to be a Roman Catholic.
Maybe I have a last question for you, and then we can open for a few minutes also the conversation with the audience here tonight. But you mentioned Daniele Bartoli. Daniele Bartoli is a strange Jesuit. He was a great writer. They call him the Dante of the Italian prose. And he wrote about the entire world, but he never traveled. He was hidden in his little room in Rome and was just writing and writing in a beautiful way about this global Catholicism. You are studying Daniele Bartoli. Give us an idea why a Jesuit with the dream of the world was ended up writing about it without seeing it.
Well, first, it's appropriate I'm saying to you as a person who looked at the letters for the Indies, the people who seek the letter iniquity, as they're called. We know that Bartoli writes 5 of these. So he's trying to get to the Indies, but he's never allowed. He's basically too valuable in the old world. Also, to give him his credit, he does get shipwrecked. Okay, so something like off Island of Capri, so it's not in the middle of nowhere. But he actually sort of on his way to Palermo to give the Lenten preaching cycle. And he actually does manage to retrieve his notes and dries them out and goes off to Palermo and lives it. But after that, he never leaves Rome again. So again, I suppose it's all about imagination. And that's what fascinates me. I suppose also the reason why I took on the invitation to write this volume was at the time my 4 children were quite small. so I couldn't move. So I thought, this is a good model. The person actually saw the world in books. So maybe again, we're back to autobiography.
Thank you so much. We can take a couple of questions from whoever wants to ask this.
You brought up a point that interests me, and I'm not quite sure if I have an answer to it myself, and so I've been thinking about it. But the reputation of the Jesuits as a missionary group and how they outshine, in a sense, these other groups. Sometimes I've thought, well, it's probably or partly because of the structure of the society. They wrote and had to report back to Rome continually. Therefore, they had documentation that none of the other groups had. So in the field, many of them may be as effective or even more effective, but because of the Jesuit structure, they had an advantage that would allow them in a way to publicize themselves in a way that the others couldn't. So I was left with that question about the relative effectiveness of the society versus some of these other groups. Certainly the society generally proved more adaptable than many of the other groups who were, in a sense, trapped in their traditional conservatism, while the society was willing to dialogue, if you will, with the culture they were in. But do you get a sense that this advantage that the Jesuit has or had played the deciding role, or really were only the appearance of having done better rather than having actually done better? That was my essential question.
Okay, I mean, I think in a way it's a very, very interesting question now, because in a way, I think it's the appearance that's what matters. But also the other thing is, of course, it was their downfall, because it really, then people were very jealous of the Jesuits. And there were, Imago Privi Seculi, that is not a humble publication. I can imagine, not just Pascal Feore is reading this. So they provoke a huge amount, and of course, you well know that there's a very famous book that's published by a former Jesuit, maybe the sort of Monte Secreto, it's the secret advice, purported to be the secret advice given by Aquavino to his priests to basically inform local rulers all over the world, to tickle the ear of rulers, that's what you should be doing. It's all about dissembling, the whole thing of the sort of wily Jesuit. And this was actually written by a man who was a Jesuit and was actually very, very, very annoyed because he refused to profess it. So he ended up with graduate. And that's, of course, a thing which I'm trying to address a bit in my book, but not enough work's been done about the different levels of Jesuit, from being sort of fully professed to a temporal spiritual practice to a rough. At any one time, probably at least in the mission fields, it's usually not always, but the portion of 1 to 4. You have 1 fully professed, and then 3 the others would be brothers or temporal or spiritual practices. So I think really what's going on. I've lost my thread here now. But the important thing really is to say that that with this guy doesn't get fully professed, writes this. It's a bit like it really does get reprinted, and in fact it's still in print in Moscow, I believe. And there's also a conspiracy theory. And this is something that the Jesuits can't really suppress, because they've always got to suppress it, the more people want to read it. And this is a particular insidious example of where I think it's the jealousy of the effectiveness of the Jesuits. But leaving that to one side, I think that absolutely, when you think about the scholarly models, you think about the degree to which, although they themselves were not, anthropologists in training, they wanted to convert souls. But quite a few of the techniques they use are then inspired later people who then we now consider ethnologists. So I think they are really dealing with a range of sources, dealing with a range of methodologies that later, I'm very aware, you're probably very aware of being theological and saying somehow they were sort of, they were contributing to progress. But they're not in that sense. They're trying to save souls. But I think it's undeniable that some of the techniques they use, some of the descriptions they made of natural phenomena all over the world, from Paraguay to Asia, are absolutely still valid observations. So I think that it's rhetoric, it's propaganda, but remember, propaganda is about propagation. Propaganda's got a bad, basically given a bad reputation in the 1930s. But really, propaganda itself is just trying to persuade and propagate, like propaganda feeding, propagation of faith. So I think that we've got to sort of not see it in a value judgment way. Does that make sense? Yeah. Sorry.
I'd like to just follow up on the last question. Were the Jesuits more successful than other orders? And I just want to bring up a very sort of nuts and bolts aspect of this, and that is some orders, like the Descalced Carmelites, who were missionaries and were in Goa and Mormons and places like that, observe the canonical hours. If you do that, it means you have a lot less time to do other things. And in my work, I have read letters from Discalced Carmelites who say things like, well, here I am in Isfahan, and I am supposed to be talking to the Shah and all of his court and convincing them that their religion is wrong and ours is right. But on the other hand, then, there are only 3 of us, and we don't have a permanent, church or house or anything. And on top of this, we need to observe the canonical hours. And we're also writing letters back to Rome, and et cetera, et cetera. And so why can't I, as the head of this house, get some more men over here? And I think that some of this is just the difference between various kinds of orders.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think really also, perhaps appropriate to end on, but actually, where it counts on one level, aside of course from Ignatius and Francis Xavier, actually, there were many more mendicants canonized in the early modern period than Jesuits. So they win the prize in that sense. But you're perhaps quite right. I mean, the whole thing is the whole genius of Loyola. He said, I don't want to be having to say the hours. A bit like actually what St. Francis of Assisi did at the beginning of the world. He wanted to go out into the world. Well, that's where the Franciscans and the Jesuits are quite similar. Obviously, they're very different from Dominicans. But I think you're right. I think that it was very difficult. Although the question of sort of person power, so to speak, I mean, really it's good to be reminded that, even at its height, there were probably never more than 30 Jesuits in the whole of China. And of those, probably about 8 priests. So it's a numbers that are extraordinary.
It is.
In a way,
Extraordinarily low numbers.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary how much was accomplished with so few men.
Yeah.
In any of these.
No, I think that's a very good point, Pat. Thank you.
So I would like first of all to thank you for this beautiful lecture. Thank you everyone for being here. And please, there are some final announcements.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much everyone.